Okay, good evening, Ellesmere Port. It's a pleasure to be here to tell you about Apollo 13. Some 55 years ago, in April 1970, we had this mission. And I'm sure many of you actually remember. Some of you perhaps are too young to remember what actually happened. I'm not going to recount all of the details. I'm going to give you a little bit, perhaps a few facts that you didn't know along the way. So back in April 1970, the mission, Apollo 13, started, like many of the Apollo missions, with the launch of the mighty Saturn V rocket, the same as was launched for Apollo 8, 10, 11, and 12. Notice 9 is missing because Apollo 9 didn't go to the moon. Apollo 9 was just a test in Earth orbit. So this was the crew. This was the original crew that was intended to be the crew for Apollo 13. Jim Lovell, the commander, lunar module pilot Fred Hayes, and command module pilot Ken Mattingly. But the backup crew had a certain individual, Charlie Duke, who unfortunately contracted German measles. And because Lovell and Hayes were immune because they had already had it, but Mattingly had not had German measles, he had to basically stand down. He was not too happy about this, but almost at the last minute, Mattingly was replaced with the backup command module pilot, Jack Schweigert. Now, Mattingly turned out to be crucial to actually the success of Apollo 13, or at least the lack of a disaster for Apollo 13, as we will find out in due course. But these are the heroic 3 astronauts of the Apollo 13 mission. Now, the story of Apollo 13, I say I will not go through all of the details, but the efforts, not only the accident itself, but the efforts of those in mission control to actually get the astronauts home safely from an accident on the way to the moon. The story of how mission controllers got them home safely is a relatively well-known story, and in particular, it was immortalized by Hollywood in 1995, 25 years after the event itself. Interesting to note that although that film seems very recent, it's actually closer to the original event in 1970 than it is to the present day. So this was immortalized in the 1995 film. So which actors are you going to get to play the 3 heroic astronauts? And if you cast your mind back to 1995, who was the most famous astronaut actor back in 1995? Yep, that's right, Buzz Lightyear, because that's the same year Toy Story came out. So instead of casting Buzz Lightyear in the roles of the astronauts, what they decided was to take 3 basic A-listers. We've got Kevin Bacon playing the part of Jack Schweigert. We've got Tom Hanks playing the part of Jim Lovell. And we've got Bill Paxton playing the part of Fred Hayes. So those 3 astronauts, those 3 actors were playing those 3 astronauts. Now, in addition, perhaps all of you knew that, maybe you've seen the 1995 film, wonderful film if you haven't seen it, but perhaps you didn't know that as well as being immortalized by Hollywood, the actual 1970 accident of Apollo 13 was also immortalized by Lego. And in fact, there is a Lego kit of Apollo 13. And if we have a look at it in a little more detail, there we see the real heroes, not the astronauts necessarily. The real heroes are the mission controllers. And there we see not the entire hundreds of mission controllers. We just see 3 representatives of mission control there, with the mission control boards in the background, a control desk in the foreground. It looks like a big red phone. Perhaps that's to the president, I don't know. On the front desk there's the Apollo 13 emergency plan, which is open, and a cup of coffee. All of these rather essential elements for the people that are trying to get the astronauts home. The 3 representative mission controllers, these are the Lego minifigs. We've got a flight director in the middle. He's supposed to represent Gene Kranz with the sort of the buzz cut and the rather stern-looking expression. And we have a couple of generic mission controllers. Fido on the left, flight dynamics officer. He's the officer responsible for the trajectory of the spacecraft, and a generic aeronautical engineer on the right-hand side. It looks like not only is Gene Kranz in the middle there looking rather stern, I don't know why, but the flight dynamics officer looks quite cheerful. And the one on the right, the aeronautical engineer, appears to be not only grimacing, but also breaking a sweat as well. Perhaps that's an indication of just how hard the mission controllers had to work to get the astronauts home safely. The astronauts themselves, again, immortalized in Lego minifigs. We've got the commander in the middle, Jim Lovell. We've got the lunar module pilot on the right, Fred Hayes. And we've got Jack Swigert on the left-hand side, the command and service module pilot. Again, if you look at the expressions, Jim Lovell, the commander, he seems cheerful enough. On the right-hand side, lunar module pilot Fred Hayes. Well, they never actually got to land on the moon, so in that sense, Fred Hayes didn't have his job to do as lunar module pilot, so that's why he's maybe smirking slightly. But look at the grimace on Jack Swigert. He was in command of the command module itself. That's where the accident actually took place, so perhaps that's why Lego decided to put a bit of a grimace on the face of Jack Swigert. There's the rather crude Lego model. This is not a very large scale. It's only 500 pieces, this particular Apollo 13 set. So there's not a huge amount of detail in the Apollo spacecraft, but I like the idea that it comes in two versions. The versions before the accident, which exploded in the service module here, and the version afterwards where the entire side is blown away. So it's nice that you can build this model and you can have one version or the other, pre-explosion or post-explosion. Quite a nice idea, that. For those that prefer accuracy in their Lego models, this is a different, this is Apollo 11. This came out on the 50th anniversary of the moon landings, the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, and you can see the scale is rather different and the detail is rather different. So yes, Lego are capable of some quite exquisite models when they decide to put their mind to it. So let me go through, I've already mentioned one or two abbreviations. Let me just make sure everybody is up to speed on the abbreviations I'm using in this talk. This is the Apollo spacecraft as launched by the Saturn V rocket to get them to the moon. There's the service module, which provides the astronauts with all of their power, their oxygen, their water. The astronauts themselves spend most of their time in the conical middle section, the command module, and on the right we have the lunar module. The abbreviations normally used is the cylindrical shape at the back there. The service module provides all of the services for the astronauts, power, water, fuel, etc. for the main engine on the back end there. The command module is usually abbreviated to CM, and not surprisingly, the lunar module is abbreviated to LM. But because the service module stays attached to the command module for essentially the whole mission, except right at the end when the two separate, the two are considered almost as one spacecraft and are often simply labeled as CSM, the command and service module, because they are so intimately related, the two. Whereas the lunar module does separate from the command and service module to go down onto the surface of the moon. So let's first, to make sure everybody's on the same page, let's say what was supposed to happen in a typical Apollo mission, what actually happened. Well, the Apollo spacecraft, the service module, the command module, the lunar module, spend about 3 days after the Saturn V has got them into orbit. They're then sent off to the moon, and it takes approximately 3 days to get there. At about 25,000 miles an hour when they first leave the Earth, it takes about 3 days before they get to the moon. The astronauts spend most of their time, as indicated by the Lego minifigs here, the astronauts spend most of their time in the command module. That's where the couches are, that's where they sleep. They spend some of their time in the lunar module prepping the systems there. As they approach the moon, the two moonwalkers then move into the lunar module and basically power up the systems there, get everything ready, and then eventually the CSM and the LM separate, and the lunar module goes down to the surface, taking the two moonwalkers with it, and one of the astronauts stays in the command module as it orbits the moon, basically looking after the mothership whilst the two astronauts are on the moon. So the two astronauts there will plant a flag, kick up some dust, run a few scientific experiments, lay out some scientific experiments which hopefully should run for quite a few years on the surface of the moon. And when they're done, and that could be anything from a few hours in the early Apollo missions to a few days in the later Apollo missions, once they are done, the entire lunar module doesn't come back up to orbit, only the top half, the ascent module. The descent module stays and acts as a sort of launch pad, if you like, for the ascent module. So the bottom half of the lunar module stays on the surface of the moon. The ascent stage, because you don't now need the descent stage and its engine and its fuel, there's no point dragging that back up to orbit. So the ascent stage brings the two astronauts back up, and then you have a rendezvous with the mothership. So in other words, there's a very careful bit of docking and a careful bit of synchronization to get the astronauts linked up again. Once they've docked, they reopen the hatch, and then the astronauts from the lunar module are free to move back into the command module and take any moon rocks with them or anything else they wanted to take back home. Once they've done that, once they're all back in the command module, there is no need at all for the lunar module. There's no point in firing and wasting fuel, firing your rockets and taking the ascent stage of the lunar module back to Earth. So basically it is jettisoned. And it either goes into orbit around the sun or perhaps crashes into the moon, depending on exactly how they jettison it. Once they've jettisoned the lunar module, we now have 3 astronauts back in the command module, and now it's another 3-day trip back to Earth again. Once they get close to Earth, they are again moving at about 25,000 miles an hour. They don't put any brakes on, they just come hurtling into the Earth's atmosphere at that speed. Now that they are approaching Earth, the service module has done its job. It has been providing them with power and oxygen and water for the last week or more, depending on how long the mission is. But as they approach Earth, they no longer need the service module, so the service module is ejected, and then that leaves the 3 astronauts in the conical command module for the last final stage of coming down to Earth. So as they re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, hopefully they slow down a little bit because of the pressure building up in front of the heat shield. It compresses air, the heat shield gets very hot, then parachutes open to bring them down, hopefully nice and slowly, into the Pacific Ocean. Yes, I know that is not the Pacific Ocean, that's the Indian Ocean, but it was just a nice picture of the Earth, and I didn't want to change it so that it actually showed the Pacific. So the Gulf of America. That I think you'll find is Africa, for those who don't know their geography. So that's how it's supposed to work. So now we've got an idea of what an Apollo mission is supposed to be, we can ask ourselves what happened with Apollo 13. What actually happened? Everything started the same, launch from a Saturn V into orbit and then on their way to the moon. But what was different was on the way to the moon, a little beyond halfway, at about the 2-day mark, something went wrong. Bang. Houston, we've had a problem. At the time, the astronauts heard a loud bang. The entire spacecraft started to buck around like a bronco. They did not know what was going on. They could not see what was going on because none of the windows in any of the spacecraft, neither the command module nor the lunar module, none of those windows allowed them to see the back end of the spacecraft where the explosion had taken place. So they were basing everything that they could do on the telemetry that was in front of them. And the same for mission control. There were no cameras that allowed them to see what was happening. So both the astronauts and mission control had to decide what they were going to do based on the telemetry, based on the information they were getting. And given that the explosion took out not only a lot of infrastructure within the service module itself, it also damaged some of the sensors. They were not sure whether the sensors were actually reading correctly. So they had a real problem trying to figure out, what do we do when we're not too sure what's happened and we're not too sure what our readings are telling us. But what eventually they found, this is not at the time, a lot later, they found out that what had actually happened was the entire side of the spacecraft had blown away. They didn't know that at the time. This is a much later photograph. But what they deduced happened afterwards was that inside one of the oxygen tanks, there's liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen in tanks. They are cryofuels. They have to be stirred occasionally. And it was faulty wiring, faulty insulation on one of the stirrers in the oxygen tank that caused a spark when it was stirred. When power went to the stirrer, it caused a spark. A spark in oxygen gives you an explosion. It took out the tank, and the fuel cells. The fuel cells are the power supplies for the entire Apollo mission, effectively. Yes, there are batteries, but they are charged up with fuel cells. Fuel cells take hydrogen and oxygen, combine them together to give you power and water, an essential part of the whole Apollo mission. The explosion of the oxygen tank took out a fair bit of the oxygen, and it took out the fuel cells. So they very quickly realized that if they could rely on their readings, they were losing oxygen, they were losing power. It was fairly obvious that this was a catastrophic failure of the system, and there was no way they would be able to get and land on the moon. They had to effectively say, enough is enough, the moon is lost. Both the astronauts and mission control very quickly realized the command module, which is fed by all of the supplies from the service module, is going to die. Therefore, they figured the only way we can keep the astronauts alive is to move them into the lunar module, which as far as we could tell was completely undamaged by this accident because it was in the service module on the other side of the command module. So the lunar module was still fine. So it was agreed that the astronauts would go into the lunar module, and essentially they had to power down everything in the command module. They were hemorrhaging power, they were hemorrhaging oxygen. They had to shut down everything and try and survive within the lunar module, which of course is not designed to keep 3 people alive for a long time. It's only designed to have 2 people go down on the moon and then come back again. That's it. But it was realized that they are going to have to rely heavily on the capabilities of the lunar module. So one question is, do you decide, well, we're halfway to the moon. What should we do? Should we stop, turn around and go back again to get back to Earth as quickly as possible? Well, that was a possibility, but the main engine is on the back end of the service module, and the service module has just had an explosion. If you try and switch that engine on when you don't know what the state of the engine is, you could make matters worse. The entire service module could go up. So they didn't want to risk firing the main engine. So rather than turn around and come home as quickly as possible, they decided to continue on to the moon in what's called a free return trajectory. In other words, keep going to the moon and use the gravity of the moon to pull you back in a large figure of 8 back to the Earth again. So it's quite efficient in terms of not having to fire the engine, but it's going to take you longer because you've still got to get to the moon and then get all the way back again. So they decided to carry on to the moon. The graphic doesn't show it, but they swung round the far side of the moon and then came back to the Earth. Now, the idea of how you're going to do this, well, how could they ensure that the remaining oxygen and the water and the power would last long enough to get them home safely? They did have a contingency plan to what if we had to come back from the moon with a crippled command module, but that's a 3-day journey. They were effectively trying to make everything last for 4 days, and that wasn't actually written down in the emergency plan. So they had to be very inventive. They took the power down as low as they could stand. They switched all the heaters off. They switched the computers off, which means navigation was then a problem. They had all sorts of problems on their way back to Earth when they were in this so-called survival mode. One of the problems, if you remember the film, one of the big problems they had was the fact that 3 people were continuing to breathe, but they were in the lunar module, but the carbon dioxide scrubbers that would normally keep them all healthy and keep the CO2 levels down, those scrubbers were mainly in the command module because that's where the crew spent most of their time. There were scrubbers in the lunar module, but they were not designed to keep 3 people alive for 4 days. So you might say to yourself, well, these CO2 scrubbers, they're just lithium hydroxide canisters. Why don't you just take the canisters that were in the command module and put them into the lunar module systems? Great idea, except that the command module was built by one company called North American Rockwell, and the lunar module was built by a different company called Grumman, and they have different CO2 scrubbers. In one case, they are square. In the other case, they are cylindrical. A classic case of needing to put a round peg in a square hole. So they couldn't simply move the CO2 scrubbers. So to avoid asphyxiation, they had to come up with a different way of getting one set of CO2 scrubbers designed for one system to actually work in another. They had to be rather inventive, and the people in mission control came up with the idea that if you bodge it like this and tape this onto that and extend this hose and use this and cannibalize that, you'll get a system which hopefully will keep you CO2 free for at least a few days. So they had to be rather inventive as to how they used whatever material they had to hand to come up with a solution to the CO2 problem. After a few days, they finally realized that Earth is getting bigger in the window. They were getting very cold because everything had been powered down. They were just about surviving on the CO2 levels because of the Heath-Robinson system they managed to put into place. As they started to get towards Earth, they then said, right, it looks like we're over the worst of it. We have survived 4 days. All we have to do now is to get back and splash down again. So once they were close to Earth, the 3 astronauts who'd spent all that time in the lunar module moved back into the command module. Now they say, right, what do we do now? Well, as far as they could tell, the service module had no part to play. It was damaged. They couldn't rely on anything there. There was essentially no power, no water, no oxygen coming from the service module. So they said, oh, well, at this point, we may as well let it go. So they allowed the service module to be jettisoned. And this is the point where they first got the view of what the damage was. In other words, that's when they first actually took that picture and said, look at all that damage. Yes, the damage does appear to come all the way towards the back end of the main engine of the service module, so probably it was a very good idea not to attempt to fire that engine to get back home by reversing your course rather than continuing on to the moon. So they now knew what they had to do. They now had to power up the command module, because the command module is the only module that will get them into the Earth's atmosphere. The lunar module is only designed to get them onto the surface of the moon. So they had to power up the command module. But the command module has been dead for 4 days and is freezing cold. And of course, the astronauts have been breathing out, and the water vapor in their breath has been condensing in the command module. So they're now wanting to power up the command module with a very limited amount of power that the lunar module has available, because again, it's not designed to do this. They have to bleed power from the lunar module, put it into the command module, and hope that all of the condensation on all of the switchgear that they are trying to control, they hope that none of that water is actually going to short circuit any of the switches they need to set to make sure they power up. The sequence of how you power up a command module from scratch using only a limited amount of power from the lunar module, that had to be thought about very carefully. And that's where Ken Mattingly came in, the person that was bounced in favor of Jack Swigert because of the German measles. He was on the ground. He was able to go into a simulator and practice the procedures of how do you power up in such a way that you don't overload the power coming from the lunar module. He kept practicing and practicing the routine until he was absolutely sure he could power up all of the essential systems. To hell with the non-essential systems. You need to power up all the essential systems using only the power available from the lunar module. And you just hope that the heaters to the parachutes are working. Otherwise, the parachutes are 3 blocks of ice, which are not going to open when you get into the Earth's atmosphere. So eventually, they bled the lunar module for all it was worth, took all the power they could get out of the lunar module. When they thought they had it all right, according to Ken Mattingly's procedure, they then closed the hatch between the two, cut the cables, and basically jettisoned the lunar module. Farewell, Aquarius. We thank you, was what they said as it left. We now have 3 astronauts in the command module. It's powered up at absolutely minimal levels, and you hope the parachutes are going to open. As you all know, they did, and they splashed down, and they were saved, and they were safe. Failure is not an option, is the catchphrase that came out in the 1995 film. That's what Ed Harris, who played Gene Kranz, said at the time. Actually, Gene Kranz didn't say failure is not an option. Gene Kranz, the flight director through a lot of Apollo 13, said something like, "We are going to get these astronauts home. We're going to have to figure out what the options are, and failure isn't one of them." That's a bit catchier. Failure is not an option was a bit shorter, much better for a movie poster catchphrase compared to what Gene Kranz actually said. But failure is not an option was such a catchy phrase that Gene Kranz actually used it for his autobiography title. He thought, yep, that particular phrase very succinctly reflects the attitude of everybody in mission control. Everybody, hundreds, thousands of people were working dedicated day and night to the job of getting these astronauts home. If anybody hasn't read this book, I can thoroughly recommend it. Effectively the life story or the life career of Gene Kranz from his Mercury days all the way up to Apollo. It is a hell of a read. What happened to other bits of Apollo hardware? So we know that the command module, Odyssey, made it safely back to Earth, splashed down with its 3 occupants, somewhat cold, but basically safe and sound. What about the rest of the Apollo hardware in that mission? Well, the 3rd stage of the Saturn V rocket, basically stages 1 and 2 get them into orbit, and stage 3 sends them on the way to the moon. After it actually did that job of sending the command and service module and the lunar module on the way to the moon, the 4th stage of the Saturn V rocket was effectively on a similar trajectory. So what they decided was to give it one last task to perform. They put it on a slightly different trajectory to the Apollo spacecraft itself and crashed it into the moon. They did that because the previous Apollo mission, Apollo 12, had actually put seismometers on the moon. So effectively, they used a calibration because they knew what the mass of the rocket was, they knew how fast it hit the surface, and they know where it hit the surface. They could use all of that information to calibrate the seismometers that were left by Apollo 12. So rather than just letting the rocket float around the solar system for the next 500,000 years, they decided to crash it into the moon to actually make some use of it. What about the lunar module? The lunar module Aquarius, which effectively was a lifeboat to keep the astronauts alive. It was jettisoned, as I showed you earlier, and it re-entered the Earth's atmosphere and disintegrated. However, the mission controllers knew that it was vitally important that they think about where it was coming down. The command module hopefully comes down close to the rescue ship to pick them up. But what about the lunar module? Why don't you just splash that into any bit of sea? It doesn't really matter where it comes down as long as it doesn't land on land. No, it's actually, in this particular case, vital that they know exactly where the lunar module is going. And that's because, unlike every other Apollo mission, this was different because the lunar module came home. In every other situation, the lunar module is supposed to be either left on the moon in the case of the descent stage, or crashed into the moon or left in orbit in the case of the ascent stage. So this is the only case that the descent stage of a lunar module has come back to Earth. And why is that important? It's important because the descent stage of a lunar module contains something that you really don't want to contaminate the Earth, and that is plutonium. The descent stage of the lunar module contains plutonium. We can see here RTG means radioisotope thermoelectric generator, and RTGs were used in the Apollo missions. Plutonium was taken out of the descent stage of the lunar module, put into the RTG, then the RTG generates power. You can't use solar cells on the moon in the sense that the moon takes a month to go around the Earth, so that means 2 weeks of sunshine, 2 weeks of night. If you want your scientific experiments to run continuously, you can't use solar arrays. So they wanted to use RTGs to run all of the scientific equipment. And that's fine if you've got plutonium. The plutonium will last quite a few years on the surface of the moon and run these experiments for years and years and years. But this lunar module is coming back to Earth. So they were determined to make sure the lunar module, when it came to Earth, actually came and splashed down and effectively sank into the Tonga Trench in the South Pacific, as deep as they could get to make sure it was out of harm's way. They have since checked if there are any contamination, any signs of radioactivity in the Tonga Trench, and it looks clean. So it looks like the plutonium casket, the plutonium fuel, is still intact and is going to be slowly, over the next few years, next few decades, is going to be slowly losing its radioactive potency. But they wanted to be absolutely sure that they put it in the deepest trench that they could, so they tried to steer it very carefully in that way. This is a still from the movie. Here we see actors Kevin Bacon in the background, again Bill Paxton, and of course Tom Hanks there in the middle. He's shaking hands with the captain of the USS Iwo Jima, the ship that picked them up once they splashed back down in the Pacific. So Tom Hanks is playing Jim Lovell. Which actor is playing the captain? Jim Lovell. So this is Jim Lovell himself playing a cameo in the film, playing the captain of the ship, shaking the hand of Jim Lovell, played by Tom Hanks. A nice little point there, I thought. When they did end up on the Iwo Jima, that's the point at which they found out just how much hoopla there was around the world, because Mission Control weren't necessarily telling them about how much media interest there was in the Apollo 13 mission. They weren't trying to hype it up. But when they got back, they realized the newspapers were full after 4 days of disaster, in inverted commas. They were finally full of, yes, they're home safely. I find this interesting not only for Jim Lovell reading the paper about himself. I find it more interesting to realize that on the left-hand side we have one of the astronauts who's already been put to work signing autographs of publicity material that NASA can then give away to people. I guess that happened within minutes, if not hours, of them landing. But as another point of epilogue, I thought one of the most amusing things that came after the Apollo 13 mission was the rivalry between the different engineers and workers behind the firms that built the Apollo spacecraft. Let me just fill you in. The command and service modules there and the lunar module on the right were built by different companies. North American Rockwell built the command and service module, and Grumman Aerospace built the lunar module. That's perfectly normal in these large ventures. You can't have one company build everything. So the Saturn V rocket, for instance, was built by McDonnell Douglas and Boeing and other contractors. Rockwell built the CSM, Grumman Aerospace built the lunar module. But remember, the problem developed because of an exploding oxygen tank in the service module. So Grumman thought to themselves, rather smugly, this wasn't our fault. This was North American Rockwell that had the main problem, and Grumman, we saved them. In other words, the lunar module became a lifeboat, and in effect, well, because they did use the engine of the lunar module, in a sense, got them home, even though that was supposed to be the job of the command and service module engine. So the people at Grumman, not the CEOs, the lowly workers, thought, we'll have a laugh on the part of the Rockwell engineers. So they decided, because the lunar module saved the command module, they thought they would invoice them for that. So they sent them an invoice. And the invoice was sent to the USS Iwo Jima, Houston, via the USS Iwo Jima. So what are they going to charge them for? They can't simply say saving the mission. So they charged them a towing fee. Towing, $4 for the first mile, $1 for each additional mile. Total, $400,000, give or take. Also, the power in the lunar module was used to power the command module. So they're charging them for the battery charge using the customer's own jump cables. Fair enough. But the one I really like is a few elements down where they say sleeping accommodation for 2 in the lunar module, no TV, air conditioned, with radio, with view. That's the standard way you describe a motel room, okay? But of course, sleeping for 2 in the lunar module is part of the normal mission, because you're supposed to sleep 2 in the lunar module. So they didn't charge for that because that's part of the original mission. That's prepaid. But they didn't have 2 people in the lunar module. They had 3 people in the lunar module. So they charged them additional guest in room. at $8 per night, so that's an extra $32. On top of the $400,000 towing fee, they're charging them an extra $32 for the additional guest in room. $8 a night for 4 nights. There's also other things in there. There's a discount for cash, which is interesting, and this is a government contract, so no taxes applicable. Total $312,000. So this was supposed to be a very tongue-in-cheek laugh from the low people in Grumman to the low people in North American, who took it in all jest. Apparently the CEO of Grumman and the CEO of North American were not amused by this, because it completely bypassed the normal chain of command and went straight from one set of engineers to another. But I think in the end they took it in good jest. Let me finish with a particular point. 2 little pieces of epilogue. Odyssey, the command module, was fished out of the ocean like every other command module, regardless of whether the mission was successful or not. And once it's been through the Earth's atmosphere, having heated up to very high temperatures, it obviously looks a little bit scorched. And these command modules end up in museums. Perhaps you've seen the Apollo 10 command module in the Science Museum in London. The other command modules are scattered around America. But notice, not only is it rather charred, but there's some insulation. It looks a little bit like gold foil. There's insulation there which keeps the whole of the spacecraft reasonably cool when it's up in space, it's slowly rotating, the sun is beating down on one side. It's basically thermal insulation. And NASA figured before these things go into museums, that looks really messy. What we're going to do is just strip that gold foil, that Kapton foil, insulating foil. We're going to strip that off so it looks a little nicer to go into a museum. What did they do with all of this foil, this Kapton foil? Well, a lot of technicians just held on to it. Some astronauts held on to it. And eventually, some pieces found their way into museums. And if you can find a reputable museum, you can actually buy a piece of that. Okay, there's a few square meters there. I am the proud owner of a square millimeter of that Kapton foil. Size is irrelevant, gentlemen. That is a piece of history. I own a piece of Odyssey. I own a piece of Apollo 13. If you're going to buy a piece like this, don't buy it on eBay. You'll just get a bit of Turkey aluminium foil or something. Buy it from a reputable museum where they have a provenance and they can prove that they have got it from the original people who took the Kapton foil off the surface of the command module. Buzz Aldrin has got quite a lot of this apparently, and if you want to buy a square centimetre, it's about $5,000. My square millimetre cost me about $50. It's roughly pro rata. As far as I know, you can't buy a square metre of it. They've chopped it up into much smaller pieces. Let me finish with this. 1970 was 55 years ago. This was a 45th anniversary of Apollo 13 back in 2015, where we have a lineup of astronauts and flight directors. At the lectern there is Charlie Duke. And then we have the 2 surviving astronauts, Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes. Sadly, Jack Swigert died some years after Apollo 13, 1981, I think it was. And then we have 3 flight directors, Gene Kranz, Glyn Lunny, and who else do we have there? Jerry Griffin. And then finally, the 3 on the end, we have 3 Capcoms. These are Capcoms. These are astronauts who act as the capsule communicators. They are the ones that relay information backwards and forwards between mission and control and the spacecraft. To avoid lots of people over talking to each other, there's only one capsule communicator and all communications go through them. And so these 3 astronauts at the end were Capcoms for the Apollo mission, including Apollo 13. Vance Brand, who we got there, Jack Ellesmere and Joe Kerwin. This was 2015, 45th anniversary. I checked a few days ago, and all of these individuals are still alive, with the exception of Glyn Lunny, who in the yellow tie there in the middle. Unfortunately, he died a few years ago. But everybody else, to the best of my knowledge, is still alive. Not surprisingly, they are in their late 80s or early 90s. So again, it's no surprise that these people are a dying breed. So here we have a lineup of the heroes, the astronauts, the mission controllers, the heroes who, instead of allowing Apollo 13 to become a disaster, turned it into what some believe was NASA's finest hour. And a lineup like this, a lineup of heroes who are all in their 90s, perhaps we'll never see the like of it again. Thank you very much for listening.